think we'll just keep it rolling. Okay. Okay, I think we're going to go ahead and get started. So thank you everybody for coming. My name is Emily Hall. I'm the event coordinator here at Glover. So how it's going to work for the first hour, we'll kind of have it set to be the presentation, and then we'll have the last half hour for Q&A. If you do need anything at any point, you can always let me know, or if you need to step out, that is no worries at all. There is a survey on your clipboards that's just for me to help improve our class offerings. So any feedback I greatly appreciate. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Erica, and I'll let her introduce herself.
Hi. So I am Erica. I am the IPM manager, or plant healthcare manager, kind of synonymous. And I run the watering crew and also the plant healthcare crew here at the nursery. And so, thank you, Mindy. A lot of plant healthcare problems start with water, believe it or not. Something like 60 to 80%, depending on what kind of plant it is, 60 to 80% of all of the problems that a plant experiences are related to water stress in one way or another, either underwatering or overwatering. And healthy plants are more able to fend off things like insects and diseases. And if your plant is already stressed, they can sense that and they go after those weak plants. So my job here at the nursery is to make sure that everything, once it comes off of the truck and is here, that it stays in good condition, that it's nice and pretty and sellable for people to come in and purchase and take to their own yards. And so my crew is somewhere between 15 and 20 people. And just a second ago, I was watching one of my waterers down here. Got to talk to him. Anyway, so we're going to go ahead and get started on the topic today, which is sustainable watering in Utah specifically. I am going to follow this handout that has been printed. We'll just kind of go from the top to the bottom. I'll hit on all of these different bullet points as we go down. If you have any questions as we're covering something, if you need me to re-explain something in different words, just let me know and I'm happy to do that. But what we're going to start with is just kind of an overview of some of the challenges that we have here in Utah anyway. Specifically, that we have an arid climate. It's no surprise that we have an arid climate, but I think a lot of people don't realize how bad it is sometimes. It's natural for us to be usually ranked the second driest state in the nation by precipitation. We do not get a lot of rainfall, which contributes to our alkaline soils. So our high elevation, being closer to the sun, bakes our soils a lot faster than those at sea level. And also the lack of precipitation, it contributes to the alkaline soils because it limits the amount of organic matter that is available, and organic matter naturally increases the pH level of the soil, or excuse me, decreases, so it's more acidic. So like if you think about the Pacific Northwest, where it rains all of the time, they have so much vegetation that vegetation, when it starts to die back just during natural life cycles, and it has this accumulation of debris, organic matter on the soil, and then that availability of moisture increases fungal activity, etc., and that breakdown, the addition of that organic matter makes that soil naturally more acidic. Here, where we do not get a lot of rain, we do not have a lot of organic matter, and so our soils tend to be really high in pH. We are also an ancient lake bed, which most native Utahns know, but for the people who are moving to the state, they may not know that this used to be Lake Bonneville and some other forms of ancient lakes. And being in this valley, and a lot of our western valleys, all the way out to the salt flats and things, it's sediment from the lake bed, and so that makes the soil quite dense and very clayey and hard to dig in and hard to amend. But there is the difference between a normal arid climate in Utah and what is considered an emergency or an extreme drought. We are even farther into these drought conditions than we typically are. We've all heard a lot about potential for water restrictions this year. I haven't heard any really specific restrictions, except maybe for some municipalities, some city buildings, and county complexes, etc. But the potential is there. A lot of people in our communities use secondary water, and that is more than likely going to be the first water source that is limited if we end up running out. And if we keep having wildfires like we have been having that are just massive and out of control, we're draining reservoirs even faster than normal trying to control these fires. And so at some point this summer, if the weather conditions don't really change, we're looking at some pretty dire situations. It's pretty obvious that landscape water use, residential landscape water use directly affects lake levels. But people don't really understand that not only is it pumped out to some homes and also the occasional agricultural site, secondary while also being accessed from our canyons. And some of the people that live on the east sides of our valleys, through Draper, through Lehigh, through the east side of Provo, etc., some of those communities are getting their secondary water from our canyons, which is, in addition to drink, it's preventing more water from even getting to the lake. So places like Utah Lake are going to be even more salty this year because they're not receiving fresh water from our canyons like they typically do. So the salt level is going to increase. The salt doesn't go anywhere. It's the water level, the amount of water, the percentage of water that changes the salinity in those lakes. And if they're not receiving the more water and the water evaporates, then the water level decreases and the salt increases with what's left, if that makes sense. So I've already kind of talked about some of these issues that are in this next section about culinary versus secondary, but let's focus on culinary for a minute. Culinary, we have a really large watershed up here, and all of the snow that we do get, which hasn't been very much this last season, our snowpack was quite low compared to normal. All of that is collected, and after the water has been, the specific sources of water have been collected for residential use along the sides, that water is collected in treatment plants and things. And so the culinary water is treated. It's potable water. It comes from snowmelt, streams, reservoirs, lakes, and just generally speaking, the increase in population in our valley has decreased the availability of the water as well. Like, we are going through more water than we used to. And decreased lake levels mean that we're not getting as much lake effect snow. And it's all this big sort of cycle on how the water is disappearing in our area. About 25% of Utah's water supply goes to residential, business, and industry. And about 60% of that 25% is used for residential purposes. So in a typical season, you have almost no residential water use other than showers and laundry and flushing toilets and things. So there's sort of a steady level for our homes. And then once we hit that hotter weather and the plants start to grow, there's a drastic increase in water usage. And we hit this peak of water usage usually around the end of June and into July. And then it decreases again for the rest of the year. But if you were to average out those peaks and valleys, that 60% of the total water usage, about 40% of it is residential, 60% of, or excuse, indoor residential, and the other 60% is outdoor landscape residential use. So secondary water is untreated. It's usually pumped straight from the water source. It doesn't go through any kind of treatment plant. And you typically cannot drink this water. In fact, sometimes, and on some, for some definitions, that water can be toxic. There are certain issues that happen sometimes, like algal blooms down in Utah Lake, and it can make that water so toxic that they tell you not even to use it on your edible vegetables in your yard. It is pretty much only used for outdoor landscape irrigation. Nobody uses this water source in their house. It would not be advisable. But along with it come a lot of seeds, like a lot of weed seeds, a lot of sediment, a lot of salt, like actual salt buildup will come through the pipes and into your yard. And this is the water source that I mentioned is more than likely going to be shut off first if we end up having these restrictions. And long term, it may not even be this season that we have these water restrictions. It could even be potentially next season. If we end up draining all of these reservoirs this year for the fires and for landscape residential use, there won't be any water next year. We're not likely to get really heavy winters every year going forward. It's really unlikely that we're going to recover massive amounts of moisture in our valley. So we all just kind of need to come together and do what we can to limit our excessive use of the water so that we're more mindful and that we kind of respect everyone's access to the water. Okay, so we're going to get a little bit into the science of water usage and how plants use water. So water, okay, have you ever, I know all of you have been sitting at a table somewhere and you've had a glass of water or soda and you have a straw in it and you put your mouth around the straw and you suck the water in, and the pressure, the air pressure on top of that water is what pushes it down and up through the straw. It's something called negative pressure rather than positive pressure. Plants access water in the same way. If you think about a plant, it's like a giant straw. And the water comes into the roots through negative pressure. And that negative pressure is pulled by these little tiny microscopic openings in the leaves and needles of plants that are called stomata. And the stomates, they open and they release water pressure up there in the crown of these plants. During the process of photosynthesis, water vapor is produced and it's released through these stomata, and that is what pulls the water in through the roots. And so the negative pressure is important to keep in mind, because when we have events like hot wind or excessively hot temperatures, the loss of that water vapor is faster than the roots are able to take up the water. So sometimes there's not really anything that you can do to prevent the damage because it's leaving the plant faster than you can put it into the plant. Roots require pore space and oxygen in the soil to function properly. So if you had a plant that was quite literally sitting in water, a plant that wasn't genetically predisposed to water conditions. You know, we're not talking pond plants or lake plants. This isn't like bald cypress in the south that live in the water. If you were to take this marigold right here and you were going to put it into water, it more than likely will suffocate and it will drown because it doesn't have the access to gas exchange to take in the water in the roots. It's just like as the human, if you're held under the water too long, you drown and die. A lot of the plants that we have in our landscapes are exactly the same way. They cannot take up water if they're sitting in water. And roots will grow toward where the water is available. So if the water is only ever available at the surface through typical like lawn irrigation, you know, lawn sprinklers are designed to wet the top couple inches of the soil because that's the depth of turf roots. Turf roots are usually only at the surface. Then your roots are going to follow that surface water. They're going to want to go where the water is available. And if the water is never available low down, they're never going to grow low down. So the kinds of trees like honey locusts and willows that are planted in somebody's yard that have these big knuckles or knobs in the middle of the turf, that goes back to when that tree was younger and it was not given enough water because those roots sought surface water at that point. Had that tree been watered more deeply early on and consistently through its maturity, the roots would stay deep and you wouldn't have these giant knuckles in the turf. Now, there are a few trees that are kind of known for surface roots, but you still can avoid things like that, like lifting concrete and driveways and things with proper deep watering. And then the deep infrequent watering encourages deeper root systems, enables greater drought resilience, and frequent shallow watering keeps roots near the surface and makes plants vulnerable to drought stress. Okay, I know I read that really fast, but it's because I want to bring up this diagram, and I guess I'm gonna have Vanna come hold it for me again. Can everybody see this? Okay, so we're gonna talk about the deep watering again, now with visuals. So this plant right here has been watered in a shallow and frequent manner. This plant has been watered once or twice or 5 times a day, like turf sometimes. And the water, while the soil is drying out, it dries out from the top down. So the second phase, the water is just below this root system and it's not really available to these roots, but it might really be touching it. And then this amount of water is gone fairly quickly. It's not available for a long amount of time to this plant. And this plant right here will wilt very quickly because it cannot access this water. Its roots are too shallow. And then very quickly after that, when the water is completely gone, that plant can suffer permanent damage and it won't recover. If we look at this with deep watering, this entire soil column is filled with water. And as that water evaporates and the soil typically dries out, the roots down low are still able to access that water. And this plant is still healthy and it's still growing. And it's only when that water is limited that this plant starts to suffer. But you can see that these roots still are touching that water that's at the bottom, and it still can access enough water that it can make it through drought, that it can recover when more water has been added. So deep and infrequent watering creates a deep root system. This is if we just randomly, arbitrarily assign some numbers to this, imagine that this is 1 quart of water, but this is 1 gallon of water. This gallon of water has the same evaporation rate. It's going to lose the same amount of water per day as this one, but the availability of that water tides over the plant for a longer amount of time. So you only have to refill this 1 gallon of water maybe once or twice a week in some cases, where this quart of water, you have to refill it 4 times as often as this gallon. So you're actually creating more work for yourself in this situation as well, where you're having to monitor and make sure that those plants are getting water far more frequently than if you water deeply and less often. So we're gonna just kind of go over these bullet points again. Roots follow available water. If the water is never down here, these roots are not going to be down here. Shallow systems create weak, stunted plants that are prone to not only drought stress, but those other kinds of problems that I was talking about with pests and diseases. And these deeper, thicker, fuller root systems lead to healthier plants that grow faster and more vigorously. And these plants with that access to water can still recover and resist drought conditions. This is something right here focusing on survival. I want everybody here and everybody who's watching to understand that you do not need an award-winning green lawn this summer. What you need is just enough water to keep your lawn alive until better conditions come back around. We're not asking you to stop watering. In fact, stopping your water can be a bigger detriment to everybody. It creates more heat island effect, et cetera, et cetera. So don't just cut off the water and say, well, we're in drought conditions, I shouldn't use any water. You definitely need to keep your landscape alive. Prioritize your trees. We're going to talk about that a little bit more in depth, but prioritize your trees. They're the largest things in your yard. They give you the most return on investment. They provide a lot of shade and cooling for not only your yard, but different neighborhoods in the valley. I don't know if you guys have ever consciously noted that when you're on the east and north sides of the valley, it's cooler than it is out here on the west and south parts of the valley. It's because they have a mature canopy of trees over here, and we're still working on our trees on this side of the valley. The trees collectively reduce the temperatures and they shade the ground from becoming a heat sink. If the sun reaches the ground, and if the ground is rock, we'll talk about xeriscaping, but if the ground is rock, it just collects that heat as a heat sink and then it reflects it back upward. And so the more canopy we can have, the cooler we can make our valley, and the easier it is to keep the smaller plants alive. So survive, not thrive. I want everybody to focus on just keeping their plants alive. They don't need to be award-winning, okay? All right, I think we're done with the graphic. We can probably set that back for a second. Yes. Uh-huh. Yeah. So I'm going to just repeat the question because I'm sure nobody heard. This guest just received a water bill saying that they used 12,000 gallons of water in their last billing cycle. And the question is whether that's a lot or not. It's actually pretty reasonable. Any given watering cycle, when you're putting water out on your yard, it's easy to use thousands of gallons of water if you have overhead or fixed sprays or rotor sprays, one very easy, we'll caveat to that, but very easy way to reduce your water usage is drip. You lose so much water in our arid conditions through these fixed spray heads. So much of it just goes immediately into vapor in the air and gets carried over to your neighbor's yard. Where are you watering their lawn? Where drip focuses that water right on your plants. And typically those drip emitters are shaded by the plant so you don't lose as much just to plain heat and evaporation, etc. So you can reduce your water usage by thousands of gallons every irrigation cycle just by switching to drip. Sure, it can be a little bit complicated to go from overheads to a drip system. It can cost money, it can take some time, it can, you got to have certain kinds of parts, etc. So I'm not saying it's easy, but it's a simple fix for drastically reducing the amount of water that you're using. I am not at all surprised about 12,000 gallons in a watering cycle. So I don't think you should feel guilty. In fact, I think that's a pretty good number compared to a lot of the people that are in this valley. They have no concept of what they're using. The fact that you came here and you were able to tell me what was on your water bill is already props to you, because most people don't have any idea what they're paying for. Actually, you can. Yeah. So to follow up on that is, can you use drip in lawns? There is a system. The brand name that I'm familiar with is called Netafim, but there are other, competing brands and things. But essentially what it is a distribution line, and it has predetermined spacing of emitters. They're inline emitters. You don't have to run spaghetti hoses to everything. They're just in the line. And what you do is you create a grid pattern out of it. You run a big square underneath a lawn, and you run it like this, back and forth through it. And you have an emitter spaced every so often. And then what you do is you select species of grass that are clumping or running, depending on what you want, but that are drought tolerant. And you place the mother plants right at those emitters. And after a certain amount of time, they will fill in and give you a turf that is running on drip irrigation. The Conservation Garden Park, I'm not 100% sure they still have it, but they have had examples of beds and turf that were irrigated on drip. It is possible. And I'm not saying that lawns have no place in the landscape. They absolutely do. I'm a professional horticulturist, and I would much rather you have lawn than rocks. Even if it meant your entire yard was lawn and you were still using more water than someone with rocks, you are contributing to cooling the neighborhood versus heating the neighborhood and exacerbating the problem. That being said, you can still water your lawn efficiently. And if the only time you're ever walking on your lawn is to maintain your lawn, you need to think critically about whether you need that lawn or not. I don't have any lawn. I tore it all out, but I don't have kids. My nephew doesn't run around and play soccer on my turf. He's got a lawn at his house that he can do that. So I tore all of mine out and I have trees and shrubs. But the point is, if you're only out there to mow it, do you need it? If you're going to have a water-wise landscape that is not turf, have plants and mulch. Those plants help, again, with that canopy that I was talking about, like the trees, the canopy. Those plants shade the ground and they cool everything down. And you can have that drip irrigation run to each plant, and you can conserve and keep the water in your yard rather than losing it in the air. Yeah, please do. Okay, so The next section on this, we're going to talk about our problems and stress. The left side of this is about soil salinity and chemical drought. Okay, we're going to go back to the secondary water for a second. You remember how I was saying, I hope most of you remember junior high science classes with the percentage of salt in the water, more water, less percentage of salt, lower percentage. Same thing happens with osmosis. Osmosis is through a membrane. Naturally, if the salt level is higher on one side of the membrane than it is on the other side, then we'll go through the membrane until it is equal on both sides. So if you have 5% salinity over here and you have 50% salinity over here, you're going to lose water, and this is going to go up to 6, and this will go down to 49. And you're going to lose water, and this will go up to 7% salt, and this will go to 48, etc., until those numbers are both 25. Okay, the math doesn't math, but you get the point, right? Okay, so osmosis is real when it comes to roots. Roots are very thin, and that's how water is absorbed into the plants. And if the salt level is higher outside the root in the soil from salt buildup, from your secondary water, from fertilizers, etc., you can actually pull water out of the plant into the soil to try and reduce the soil salt percentage. You can cause a reverse of water out of the plant and cause chemical burn. And chemical burn can look a lot like drought conditions, even when it's not drought. So you could be watering and watering and watering with secondary water, and you're only making the problem worse because the salt is just getting higher and higher and higher, and those plants are struggling more and more and more. And this summer, with the limited water reaching the lake, this is going to be a really big issue. So what we typically recommend for secondary water is leaching with culinary water. So usually people have a hose bib attached to their house that is culinary water. You need to take that bib and go with your hose out to certain areas of your yard, and you need to get that soil extra super saturated with clean water to help sort of dissolve a lot of those salts. And as that water is draining through the soil, it will grab some of that salt and wash it down and out of the root zone next to those plants. So this process is called leaching. And if you have secondary water, you need to be leaching your beds around your shrubs and perennials, annuals, trees. You need to be leaching those beds somewhat frequently. I would recommend a few times a month at minimum, but it also depends on how often you're irrigating. If you're fairly water wise and you're only irrigating once a week, even with secondary water, you may not need to leach as often as somebody who is irrigating 5 times a week. Shouldn't be irrigating 5 times, but that's another point. And then the right side of this column is how to tell the differences between over and under watering. Overwatering actually is a little bit hard to tell apart from underwatering. Overwatering usually will end up with yellowing plants. They go a pale yellow, and the leaves are usually, the leaves that yellow are usually interior leaves first. They're lower and inside the plant. They go yellow and droop. But when you go and touch those leaves, they tend to be soft. They're not usually crispy. They usually are soft and tear easily, or they could even be mushy depending on how badly it's overwatered. But those leaves can drop off the plant, and you can think, oh, it must need more water, but that's not actually true. It's too much water that's causing that issue. And then the reverse for underwatering, usually those leaves that are experiencing the damage will be at the very tree or a shrub first, because the water isn't able to reach all the way up there before there is just a limited amount of water. It can only go so far, and those leaves will go crispy. They usually crisp right at the margins of the leaf first. It's not a whole leaf that goes crispy. It's just the tips of that leaf and then a whole branch. I do have a couple of examples of plants that have been underwatered, and the reasons for this are varied, but I'm gonna go ahead and pull one of these leaves off, and we're gonna talk about this one. Can you see this okay, Emily? Okay. So this plant has been underwatered, and you can see that this leaf is curled upward. And then I'm going to turn this leaf like this so that she can get this in the video. This lower part of the leaf is still green, but it's the margins of this leaf that are burned. And this is like textbook underwatering. I actually would really like to get a close-up of this because I want everybody to be able to see this. So you tell me when it's close and like really in focus, okay?
A little bit. Okay, good. You're good there.
Okay, so the edge of the leaf is light tan color. Is that in focus? Okay, so the edge of the leaf is a light tan color, and then there's a really dark brown line that separates that damage from the green tissue. I'm going to pass this leaf around in a second, and I want you guys all to look at this. The very dark brown line is textbook underwatering. Now that I've shown you this, if you go look at another plant, like this hosta that I have right here on the ground, I will point out this brown line on that hosta. So if you're looking at any tree, any shrub, and you can see this really dark margin, this line between the crispy and the green, you know that there was a lack of water at least one time. If there is more than one brown line, it is a tree that is being consistently underwatered. It's underwatered and underwatered and underwatered, and you will see 4 or 5 or 6 of these brown lines in a leaf, and you know that there is an issue with access to water. So in this hosta, the brown line is there, but because it's a fleshier leaf, it's a different kind of plant, the brown line is visible. It may just not be quite as dark as it is on this catalpa that we're passing around. Or is this a chalopsis? I don't know. Okay, so underwatering is usually curled upward. Overwatering is usually downward. If the leaf is happy, it's usually flat. Whether it's hanging or not, it's usually flat. Some plants have hanging leaves, some plants don't. So the position of the leaf might be different, but usually that leaf will be flat and not curled at all. But if it is curled upward, it's usually a good sign that it's not getting enough water. And if it's curled downward, it's a good sign it's getting too much water. Yes?
They're great to understand for deciduous plants. How can you tell with evergreens?
So the question is about telling drought stress on evergreens. That brown line will appear in the needles as well. You'll have a really distinct light yellow or tan tip of the needle and a dark brown line, and then it'll be green. Or you'll have 2 brown lines and it'll be green. So there is a very similar response in conifers. So like in arborvitae, sometimes you'll see this in arborvitae where across several of the scaled leaves like this, you'll see kind of a consistent brown line that runs across the whole thing. And on each individual scale will be a dark brown line before the green. So almost the same. You may not see the curling on a conifer, but you will see on the conifers that have candles, you will see a drooping candle if it's thirsty. If that tree is happy, that candle will be straight, whatever the angle of it is supposed to be. You know, like I was saying, some plants have droopy leaves, some conifers have droopy candles, like a weeping white spruce. They're supposed to be down, But on a weeping white spruce, if it's thirsty, they'll be bent. They won't be straight. And the very tippy top, the very topmost candle is kind of your very first indicator because it's the farthest away from the roots. That's the one that's going to show the drought stress the soonest. It may not be super exaggerated. It may not be completely like this, but it'll be visible. And that's actually, for me, managing the watering crew here, that's how I tell the guy that I have in charge of my conifers, that's how I tell him to tell if one of them is thirsty. Is look at the candles. Okay, so we're going to flip over to the back side of this now. Best practices. So the first bullet point on here is know your plants. This is really, really important. There are a lot of plants that are sold in places like the big box stores, and you as a customer would think there's no way they would sell this plant if it doesn't survive in Utah, but that's absolutely not the case. They sell all kinds of stuff that won't survive here. They sell things, even we are guilty sometimes of selling things that on their tag will say perennial, but it's misleading because it's perennial in its native climate, but it may only be an annual here. In that case, it's a temperature issue. We get too cold in the winter. It's usually not that we get too hot in the summer. It's that we get too cold in the winter and they freeze out. But knowing what that's in your yard is going to help you with zoning correctly. You can group all of your plants by their water needs. If you put all of your thirsty plants on the same zone or station of your sprinkler clock, then you can run those longer than you run the other things in your yard. Knowing that dogwood shrubs are native to river banks, they're riparian. Dogwood shrubs want a fair amount of water to be happy. If you go plant one in your yard, it is not going to be as water efficient. You're going to have to water it more often than if you plant a Mojave sage in your yard. Mojave sage want almost no water. If you run water to a Mojave sage, more than likely you're going to rot it out and it will die faster than anything else in your yard. You'll go, well, it's supposed to handle low water. Well, once a month might even be too often for it. There are agave and yucca that we sell. I have salvias in my yard, I have yuccas, and I have agaves that I have never once watered. They only get the precipitation that is offered to us, and they're perfectly happy. So knowing that this plant wants a lot of water and this plant wants a little bit of water can help you group plants by their water needs, but also can direct you in how to set your stations, knowing that this station might need to run 3 times a week where this station could run only once a week, or this one needs to run for 30 minutes where this one only needs to run for 5 or 10 minutes. So that can help a lot, knowing your plants. Another thing I just want to throw out there is a plant in a container in the nursery, before it gets put in the ground, before it has an established root system, can have drastically different water needs than once in the ground. We sell things here that are considered drought tolerant, but only once established. My crew waters the barberries here that are in the containers out here just 50 feet from me. We water them 3 times a day when it's above 90 degrees so that they don't fry. If you take one of these home and you set it out on the side of your garage and go, well, they told me it was drought tolerant, you're going to fry it in less than a day if you don't water it frequently enough before it's in the ground. Once it's in the ground, those roots are shaded. They are cooled. They can handle less frequent water. But less frequent water could still mean once a day until it starts setting roots. So understanding those things is really important to knowing the success of your plant. If you're buying new plants, ask how to care for them until they're in the ground, and ask once they're in the ground for their newly establishing phase, how often do I need to water them? And then once they are established, how often do I need to water them? And the amount of water can change. A 5-gallon tree may only need a few gallons of water every time it gets watered, but a tree that's got a caliper this big in your yard may need hundreds of gallons every time you water it. I mean, ideally, but that hundreds of gallons can be spread out through, through a large area, etc. So water needs can change through maturation as well. So, okay, second bullet point is mulch. This goes back to the rock. I would much rather have you use a bark or other organic type mulch on your yard to shade your soil and maintain moisture. That it's going to be imperative as we go into the worst of the drought conditions. People who have bare exposed soil are the people who have that white clay that is like concrete in their yards. You put a couple inches of mulch over that and you keep it covered, and that clay will soften up and it'll become workable and the plant roots can get through it. If it's like concrete, these tiny little roots cannot break it. They can't get through it. If it's not friable, they have nowhere to go. And so you're hindering your plant development as well by having really soil. Even if you did nothing to amend the soil itself, if you are one of the people that wants to use completely native conditions and things, there is logic to that, but the soil still needs to be friable. So if you're going to do that, you need to pry it up and you need to break it apart so that it's loose enough that those little roots can get through it. Okay, so mulch, besides being a wonderful weed suppressor and it looks nice, it can make a difference in your moisture retention. Okay, read the landscape, not the clock. There very likely was a time that this plant here said, I'm thirsty, before it went crispy. You need to go out and look at your plants and look at your trees, and those trees and shrubs will tell you that they want water before it's too late. And knowing what to look for is important, because on some of the plants here in the, just keep using that as an example because I'm looking past all of you at all the plants that I'm responsible for keeping happy. And some of these, some of them will have their tips wilt, and some of them will have leaves wilt, and some of them will have leaves cup. And what your plant is different than the plant next to it. So if you're not sure what to look for, come and talk to us and say, hey, how do I tell if my rose is thirsty? And we can give you some ideas of things to look for. And that can signal you as the homeowner to go out and give a little bit of supplemental water, just like with a watering can or a bucket. It doesn't have to be an extra run of your cycle if it's only one plant that's thirsty. And microclimates can make a difference too. You could have 3 of the same shrub along the side of a house, and this one, for some reason, is always thirstier than the rest. But you may not think that it's a reflection from your neighbor's window and it's baking that plant. So that really is thirstier because it's in a hot spot. So keep those things in mind as you're looking at your yard and monitoring. And the flip side is also true. Just setting your clock and forgetting it can overuse water. What if we got rain? What if we were blessed with rain and your landscape kind of didn't need water and you ran your sprinklers anyway? We've all been in these situations where you're driving down the street past a golf course or some corporate complex and their sprinklers are running while it's raining. And those are places that just kind of have this set it and forget it mentality. And, being a responsible homeowner is not watering when it's not necessary. Granted, if we only get 5 minutes of rain, it's not going to be enough. It's only going to wet the top of the soil and that plant is still going to be thirsty. So rain does not necessarily equal no irrigation. But if we do have a deluge and we do get a lot of water, try and time your clock so that it doesn't run before it's necessary. Yes.
On your microclimate study, sorry, I just water?
Yes. So just to recap that, along a property line, the neighbors' sprinklers they're reaching some of your native plants, your xeriscaping plants. Absolutely. I've had it happen too. And, sometimes you use it to your advantage. They're the ones paying for the water, right? Typically. Put some thirstier plants there. Or if you have a good relationship with your neighbor, get them to adjust their sprinklers, but that's less likely the scenario. But if as you're looking at your yard, you go, hey, this one section right here always seems like it's more wet than right over here. Put something that wants more water right there. And you run your cycle the way you always run it, and you just use their extra water to keep that thing happy. So, but it's important to really kind of study those conditions. And even still to this day, I am learning things about my own yard. And a yard is never the same from one day to the next. It's never the same from 1 year to the next. Plants grow. When I planted certain trees, they were small, and this spot might have been in full hot burning lava sun. So I put sun plants there. And now that tree is maturing and it's starting to shade out that spot. And those plants are suffering because they're not getting as much sun as they used to. So it's always a work in progress. Okay, things change, and pay attention to it. Okay, so the fourth thing, water deeply. We've kind of gone over this ad nauseum by now, I think, but if you need me to explain it again, I'm very happy to. Avoid evaporation. We did talk about those overheads and the rotary or fixed spray heads and evaporation. Reducing your evaporation can do a huge benefit to your water bill. Drip irrigation is really fantastic for that. Drip irrigation, there are some tricks to it. You have to go out and maintain it every so often. Those emitters do get clogged. Especially if you're using secondary water, you can put in some filters and things to help prevent some of the clogs, but they're going to get clogged. Sometimes it's from the dirt side of it, not the inside of the tube. And sometimes they get stepped on. Sometimes they get pulled out of their hoses, etc. There are some catches to drip irrigation, but delivering that water right where it needs to go and not having that evaporation is going to be really, really crucial. Which is the next point, drip irrigation, target precisely. Okay, we also talked about rain does not mean you should automatically skip watering. I have my crew come into the nursery and water even when it's raining because there are also things called rain shadows. And I'm just going to point at you because you talked to me about evergreens, conifers. Conifers will shed water to the sides. And sometimes that water, the rainwater that is given to us, does not reach the roots that are underneath that plant or tree. And so there is an advantage to having that drip irrigation under the canopy where it can get directly to those roots. And this is especially important when the trees and shrubs are young and that root system is quite small, very likely smaller than the crown. And until those roots have a chance to grow out into the native soil and surpass the width of that tree or shrub, they may need some extra help. They may not have access to the water if the water is way out here. So keep that in mind. And then the last point there for best practices is monitor and adjust. That's like going out and checking your drip. I check my drip several times this summer. I turn it on and walk around and go, hey, something's different over here, and I have to go figure out what has happened. Okay, adjusting for special conditions, heat waves and secondary water. Heat waves. Your plants are going to be a lot more resilient to the heat if they are properly hydrated going into the heat. You remember when I was saying that heat and the loss of water vapor can pull more water out of the plant faster than it can take it in? Well, if you start at 100%, you might only get down to 90% water inside the plant. But if you start at 60%, and you get down to that critical 50% of water inside the plant, you may not be able to recover from it. So water ahead of heat waves. Usually we have some kind of heads up. Usually the meteorologists will say, hey, this Sunday that I have to work is going to be 100 degrees. So that means on Saturday, I need to water everything very, very carefully so that going into Sunday, I'm better prepared and the things will be able to withstand the heat better. I still am going to water on Sunday, but I'll have a better chance of avoiding damage.
And does it have to be the day before? Like I did a deep watering today. Is that too far before Sunday?
Yes. So the question is about scheduling for the deep water. Yeah, I would say day before is pretty typical. Plants go through enough water in the course of a day that several days is probably not going to work to prevent the damage from a heat wave. So I would plan the day before, but even 2 days before would be better than 5 days before. So, even the morning of would be better than not at all. Okay, heat waves, monitor your plants closely. There is a chance that you may have to go out and give supplemental water even 2 or 3 times a day, like I do here on the barberries. I know what to look for on the barberries, but going out in your yard and going, hey, this plant is new, I just put it in the ground, or hey, I really want to prevent damage on this one thing. Overwatering doesn't happen with just one water. Overwatering is a habitual thing. So if you're worried about a plant, just go put a little extra water on it so that you can avoid any potential for damage. It's only if you're doing it every single day all the time that it becomes an issue. Okay, here's a good one. Do not spray foliage to cool plants. Yeah, it increases your humidity for like 5 seconds and then it's gone. And there is some debate whether or not it truly gives an opportunity to burn your foliage. But if you imagine all those little water droplets act like magnifying glasses, and then the sun is spraying, the sun is shining through those, it can create water burns. But more than likely, it's not the sun that's doing it. It's the water on the leaf creating an opportunity for disease and whatnot. But the benefits of spraying the plants is almost nil. There's no point. It is a complete waste of water. In the nursery, I call it rainbow watering, and that's what I saw one of my waterers doing about an hour ago. And that's like when you do this and you're not watering at the source. If here in the nursery, if it's not going into the pot, it's a waste. In your yard, if it's not going to the roots, it's a waste. Okay, secondary water, leach your soils. This is going to be really important, especially ahead of heat waves, because that chemical burn can happen really fast, especially with the high salt content, etc. So leach. And then the only time that something like rainbow watering is really acceptable is if you have a particularly dirty plant. You live in a really windy or dusty area and there's a buildup of soil on the leaves. Sometimes it can be beneficial to spray it off for just a minute because that can help open up those stomata for proper, photosynthesis, etc. But to clean a dirty plant is the only time that I think it's acceptable to have water intentionally applied to the leaves. Okay, what to do during an emergency drought. I hit on this a tiny bit way back at the beginning about prioritizing your trees. We're working on surviving, not thriving. I don't know if I can get you all to participate. Say it with me. Survive, not thrive. Survive, not thrive. Okay, this is going to be extremely important this summer, potentially next summer, potentially every summer thereafter, depending on what happens with Utah and our weather. But those trees are going to be really, really incredibly important to cooling our climate, cooling our neighborhoods, and creating those microclimates. They're fantastic. Shade, love shade. It's amazing. So if you have to prioritize one thing in your yard, trees. Very likely, if you are delivering water to the roots of a tree in your yard, you are also giving water to a lot of the shrubs and other things that are under that tree. So they will benefit as well. But the priority should always be trees, and then shrubs, and then perennials and perhaps turf, and then annuals and vegetables. They should be the lowest on your list of priorities. If you still want to, I mean, we're late enough in the season that most people, if they were going to plant a vegetable garden, they have done so. But if you were going to do it, consider planting a smaller garden this year, or planting more water-wise vegetables than you typically use. Melons are quite high water users, so maybe don't plant melons, etc. So just make some conscious decisions of things that you are willing to forego in order to help conserve a little bit of water. And if you have to let some perennials die, perennials cost $6 or $10 or $20 versus $40, $50 for a shrub versus $300 or $400 for a tree. And then you're also losing the amount of time that tree has been growing. If you kill a tree from underwatering that has been in your yard for 15 years, you've just lost 15 years of water and time. And if all it takes is a few extra gallons to keep that tree alive, then it's worth it. And you talk to any of the water authorities and they will tell you to keep watering your trees. So that's not just something that I'm saying as a horticulturist. It really does benefit our ecosystem here in this valley. So that kind of concludes what's on the paper. I think I've covered most everything that I wanted to about sustainable watering, but I do want to point out a couple of the things that we have here at the nursery that can help you. One would be water-wise plants. If you make the switch to things Mojave sage, I have pictures of mine at home. It is stunning when it's new. Love it. These are little like bubblers that you can attach to the end of a hose, and you can rest this at the base of a tree or a shrub and help diffuse the pressure of the water so it's absorbed into the ground a little bit easier. We do sell the watering wands that can help you get that water underneath a tree or a shrub versus spraying from back here. Sometimes the dense canopies make it really hard to get under there, so that can be beneficial. Groundbreaker is what's called a soil penetrant, and it helps break up the hydrophobic nature of some of the soil and helps it absorb water more easily. It actually pulls soil particles together and opens up that pore space. This one is really similar, Hydratane. It's another surfactant. It's another penetrant like Groundbreaker. Humic acid can help with the pH, which can help with the chemical burn. It can help reduce the pH to be slightly more acidic, and introducing organic matter can be really important. So things like soil pep, if you wanted to amend your soil, or if you just want to mulch over the top of it, that can be really helpful. We do actually sell shade cloth as well. So if you have a spot in your yard, like your veggies or something you've just planted and you want to reduce its water usage, like hydrangeas, for example, hydrangeas could use some shade in certain conditions. Shade cloth can be important. And then we also have this one that's called Slow-Mo. Is that, you got that in the picture? Slow-Mo is a product that if you apply it to your turf, it actually will reduce the growth rate of turf so that you don't have to water it as often. And how that relates to water usage is the smaller, shorter blades of grass use less water than long blades of grass. There is some advantage to having a little bit longer blade to help shade the soil out. If you have only a ½ inch of grass, it gets a lot hotter than if you have 2 inches of grass. but that 2 inches can stay there for a really long time with something like slow-mo. And this happens to be on sale. So if anybody is interested in that, we should have some bags up front. And then, yeah, I think that's about it for the presentation. Let's open it up for questions.
And then real quick, let's give a little round of applause for Erica. She does such a great job. Thank you so much. So we're gonna move into our Q&A. If you need to take off at any point, totally free. You can leave your clipboards and your surveys just on your chair. Your handout is for you. And if you need to take off, or for anybody watching, if you have questions moving forward. Perfect. Okay. Bye, YouTube. And
bye, YouTube.
And yeah, we have our diagnostics team in our main store, so they're always here if you do need to take off, and we have some questions that we don't get to. But now we're here for the Q&A.
All right.
I was watching on my computer, make sure there wasn't any glitches. Okay.
Yeah, go ahead. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think everybody here can hear that question.